Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. All right guys, so something very strange and unnerving has been happening in the last few weeks. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but it's in the realm of content creation and it pertains to your ability to be exposed to information that you might not be exposed to. Now, if you haven't realized it yet, the war is encroaching on our doorstep day after day. And historically, when a nation is at war, it becomes more authoritarian. It's just par for the course. Martial law is enacted. The media conglomerates, in concert with government, seek to interdict and stifle dissent. And it appears as though that is happening right now. Because I can tell you, in the last few weeks, I've heard more and more content creators from across the political spectrum, mostly ones who perhaps are a bit more divergent in their assessments of the situation, have been either getting deplatformed, demonetized, shadow banned. Some of them have been getting outright arrested. And this is a sign, it's an indication that NATO's efforts in Ukraine are floundering. Because when we start to lose, that's when the information war becomes all the more important. So what I foresee happening in the future is that this crackdown is going to continue. The more our efforts in Ukraine flounder, the greater the likelihood that the media stranglehold, the social media stranglehold, is going to tighten. The noose is going to tighten. Now, I want to say, before I really dive into the meat and potatoes of this video, guys, there's two ways this war is going to end. There's three ways, but the third way is, in my opinion, untenable right now, because it doesn't appear as though either side, at least in the short or medium term, has any vested interest in negotiating for peace. So the prospect of peaceful reconciliation and living in a utopian multipolar world are pretty much nil right now. But there are two other possibilities. One, Ukraine is winning. And if Ukraine is winning and Russia is pushed back to its pre-2022 borders or pre-2014 borders, then we will see the use of a nuclear weapon. There are many mainstream outlets that are trying to be dismissive of anybody who raises this concern, and the impudence of media is going to become more profound on this issue as we get closer to that possibly happening. If Ukraine starts to see success on the battlefield and the Russians are indeed pushed back up against the wall, that's when you are going to increasingly see impudence on the part of the media with respect to challenging people who are calling out the prospect of the use of nuclear weapons and this thing escalating wildly out of control. So that is one. That is one possible outcome, is that Ukraine wins and Russia uses a nuclear weapon in order to interdict. We also have the prospect that Russia is winning. And if Russia starts winning this war, that means we become more authoritarian here in the West. That means that some measure of martial law is imposed, martial law light, mostly with respect to controlling the media. That is going to happen, and you're going to see dissent stifled. You're going to see the insubordinates basically suppressed. And I'm starting to get the sense right now, as we're seeing more and more people get deplatformed and demonetized and derailed, deranked, delisted. As you see this more and more, it's an indication that our efforts there are not going so well, that we're not doing that well, that the Russians are in fact gaining the upper hand. And this is a dangerous situation. So understand our possible choices for what's coming. You have Cyberpunk, Mad Max, or you have Cyberpunk or Mad Max. You have the cyberpunk dystopia, which is the imposition of martial law in some way, shape, or form, or a more authoritarian brand of democracy and a dystopia, essentially. Or you have Mad Max, which is a nuclear post-apocalyptic wasteland. So either we're going to get dystopian, Orwellian 1984 level of controls because we're losing the war, or we're going to be winning the war, and that's going to compel the Russians to utilize a nuclear weapon, which will ultimately escalate to full-blown nuclear Armageddon. When a nation is losing a war, it must become more authoritarian, because the information war becomes far more important. People like myself and others within this milieu who try to engage in open and free discourse about these issues, we do so to the umbrage of the powers that be, because for whatever reason, our assessment of the situation, what we view as rational is not what our leaders view as rational. And that has become increasingly clear with the US government and NATO's, in general, unrelenting support of this conflict, okay? So if you're a dissident on this particular issue, it's very likely that in some way, shape, or form, you will be stifled. And this, you can see this happening in Ukraine. As Ukraine begins to lose the conflict, martial law becomes more stringent there. I mean, we've seen this happen before the first Iraq War with the Patriot Act. Could they have really done the Iraq War without the Patriot Act? So first, they come for the information. And I think today, as we live in a different world of social media controls, it's almost easier to control the narrative of people, because everybody has relegated public discourse to an online format. And as such, nobody really communicates out in the open, in the public square. The public square is now Twitter, it's now YouTube, it is social media platforms. And because these platforms are becoming hyper-politicized, they also end up becoming echo chambers. If you go on Twitter, the prevailing view is going to be that of the right. If you go on YouTube, the prevailing view is going to be that of the left, and so on and so forth. And everybody's compartmentalized into little boxes. Everybody thinks, especially people on Rumble and Twitter, think that they're somehow sidestepping these authoritarian controls. But I would exercise caution in what you say. There was, back in the 60s, Mao, right before the Great Leap Forward, they had something called, what was it called? I think it was called the 100 Flowers Campaign. And the government there openly encouraged dissent. They openly encouraged people to speak out, to voice their opinions on what they truly felt about the government and everything else. And a year later, there was a massive crackdown. A lot of people were taken out. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen here, but it's just something to keep in mind, that people may think that you have a savior in Twitter, or choose your renegade social media, decentralized, whatever. The fact of the matter is, there is a very strong likelihood that at some point in time, when the noose gets tightened, when the war approaches us, as our efforts continue to flounder, that we will start to reap the consequences of all of this openness and all of this freedom of speech. Back before the war started, Ukraine told its people not to worry, because our intelligence says that the Russians aren't going to invade. Remember that. And they knew that the Russians were going to invade, but against the advice of the US administration, Ukraine chose to be very lackadaisical in their approach to preparing for a Russian invasion. And everybody was caught off guard there. Of course, we weren't, because we had been advising people all along that this is going to happen, and that right now people are under the spell of what's called the normalcy bias, and that they would ultimately panic and clog the roadways. And when a nation is at war, martial law is absolutely necessary. There is no nation at war that does not become authoritarian. In war, all democracies become authoritarian. There's a reversion to a more centralized, consolidated form of control, which is needed in order to facilitate military logistics, in order to make sure that people aren't clogging the major arteries and getting in the military's way of defending the country. Necessarily so. The same thing is going to happen here that happened there. If you don't think that what is happening in Ukraine with respect to the conscription, the crackdown on civil liberties that is currently occurring there and is getting worse every day, I mean, we're talking about the suspension of elections and etc. And this is just my point. When a democracy is at war, it becomes authoritarian. So one can make the argument that authoritarian societies are always at war with their own people, I suppose, but that's another story. It's just something to keep in mind, that the variance of opinion is going to shrink. The pool of differing views is going to increasingly shrink as we approach the 0 day. And dissidents, I don't really consider myself a dissident so much, but I do consider myself somebody who is open to alternative viewpoints about various things in order to be truly objective and understand what's going on the front lines so you can prepare for it adequately. You have to be objective. You can't be politically charged. You can't be emotional. The same practices will be imposed here. And that means your ability to upload certain videos. There will be mockery and ridicule of anybody who goes against the state, who goes against the nation. And all of this, of course, for the sake of national security, right? I mean, this is largely due to and justified by a nation's need to control their borders, to ensure security of their executive branch, to ensure the logistics flow of supplies, and to win the war, essentially. But as we begin to lose, and this is a telltale sign, this is the indication that we are not doing so well in this conflict, is that they're starting to crack down on dissent in some way, shape, or form. Now, is this algorithmic? Is this top-down? Is it centralized? Is somebody at the top saying you got to get rid of this person? Or is it just an algorithmic thing where it's people saying too many keywords and the algorithm takes them out for whatever reason? It's possible. It's possible. It's very possible this day and age, because there's so much content being generated. The idea that people have this delusion that somebody is, on your case if you're a content creator. Maybe depending on the size of the channel, that might be true to some extent. But by and large, this is something which is AI driven in terms of online censorship. So I do believe, though, that this has been happening for some time, okay? I believe that for the last few years, people in positions of high influence and power have a much broader purview. The perch in which they sit on is much higher, and they can see further into the future. So they anticipated, like many people from all walks of life did, but mostly in the top, they anticipated this conflict between East and West was going to ensue eventually, that it was inevitable, perhaps not imminent, but inevitable. And so they knew that at some point they were going to have to control the narrative. And right now, not only are we floundering in our efforts, but support for the conflict is waning. And that means that you need to tighten the Overton window. What do I mean by that? The Overton window is the publicly acceptable range of ideas, socially acceptable ideas at any given time. In a open, democratic society, the Overton window is very large. You can talk pretty much about anything and not be castigated for it, not be suppressed. But as we become more authoritarian necessarily because we become more involved in the war, and as some diluted form of martial law is imposed here before the real martial law is imposed, the Overton window shrinks. What you're allowed to say becomes more congested into a narrow band of talking points. You can either be very pro-Ukraine or mildly pro-Ukraine, but you can't be anti-anything. Whereas before, when we're winning, it doesn't matter, right? If we're winning, you can be as anti-Ukraine as you want. Not anti necessarily, but just critical of how things are run, critical of our support. But the Overton window contracts as martial law is imposed. Right now, the Overton window is shrinking. What you can say, what you can't say, is shrinking. And for people who think that Twitter is going to be your safe space to openly vent and vocalize about everything, make sure you're not getting trapped. That's all I'm going to say. One thing I've always been concerned about with technocrats like Elon Musk, and he's a technocrat. If you don't know what a technocrat is, it's somebody who, in the objectivist fashion, in the sense that irrespective of emotions or ethics or morality, you will want society to be governed by the tenets of technology and science, irrespective of the human condition, irrespective of philosophy, religion, things of that matter. So all I'm saying is don't be duped by Elon Musk as the great savior of the world. Do you truly think that he would be permitted to do what he's doing if he was really going against the grain in any big way? It's very unlikely. It appears as though what's happening is that we're being compartmentalized right now into different domains of social media. And because understand, they don't want to silence people. That's not what, and I say that tongue in cheek because, you know, who is they? If I was a centralized power, I would not want to silence people. Because you want, just like Mao wanted, you want people to openly express themselves. And you want them to do so vehemently. You want them to be passionate. You want them to feel free to openly and express their true beliefs. So that when the time comes, you know where everybody is. You know who's a liability and you know who isn't. Now, if this war gets worse, which it appears it's going to, then you can bet that people are going to get their numbers pulled. Okay? They're going to have this huge database of information that everybody has felt almost revolutionary in voicing their opinion. People think that they're putting one over the centralized power structure by you know, now we have Twitter to voice our opinion on. Well, just be careful, because maybe that's part of the plan. You just never know. Now, I don't want to fuel anybody's like paranoid delusions about, because there's enough of that on the internet as is. I'm just saying we're entering a very, very dangerous period of time. And it gets more dangerous as we potentially lose this conflict. In fact, it's dangerous either way, because no matter what happens, there's a high likelihood that because our economic hegemony is staked to a victory in Ukraine, it's almost as likely we provoke a nuclear response as much as the Russians will if we encroach on their borders with nuclear weapons. And we basically made it abundantly clear that when Ukraine wins the war, we will make them a member of NATO. If they're a member of NATO, that means they get NATO equipment that can carry nuclear weapons, and they're already going to get that with the F-16s anyways. But it means that they're going to be fully interoperable, meaning that nuclear weapons, tactical ones, short-range, medium-range ballistic missiles will be right on Russia's doorsteps, and that means that Russia will absolutely, without hesitation, they will utilize a nuclear weapon. Back in September of 2022, the Russians stated they will never, ever abandon these 4 annexed territories that they've acquired in Ukraine. And Ukraine has been very steadfast in its demands with its own peace plan, which necessitates the Russians get out of the country, which of course the Russians deem as a threat to their existence. So we have Mad Max nuclear war, or we have dystopian cyberpunk. Maybe that's why Elon Musk is getting the Cybertruck ready for us. You know, I do think Elon is genuinely a person who doesn't harbor any like ill will towards humanity per se. I do think he somewhat wears his heart on his sleeve, but I would question his true motives, or I would question whether or not he isn't being played either. Anyways, going back to the main point of this video is that they're starting to crack down. Okay, so don't be surprised if we don't see some of your favorite YouTubers' daily updates start to go silent at some point in time. And that's how you know that war is coming, and that's how you know that the war isn't going so well for us. In terms of what you can do as an individual, the best thing you can do, the most revolutionary act, no matter what era you are in, is self-reliance and preparedness, and focusing on your local sphere of influence. Focusing on activities that are decentralizing to some extent, as opposed to this increased push for consolidation of power, which is necessary for a nation who is about to go to war. Last year, in early 2022, the Trudeau government invoked the Emergency Powers Act, which is very much akin to a War Measures Act. In fact, I don't think it had ever been utilized up until that point. And they did that, and you know, all politics aside, whether you agreed with the protest or not, whether you agreed about, you know, all the mandates and whatnot or not, this led to a erosion of civil liberties unlike anything we'd ever seen before. Okay, people having their bank accounts seized. It gave the government a lot of power in terms of how they can control people's lives. And if you actually read a lot of the Emergency Powers Acts, the provincial ones that were imposed throughout the pandemic over the last 3 years, the government by law had a lot of authorities that it didn't actually use, but it lawfully could have, like confiscating people's property. And you really got to read these things. Throughout the actual pandemic, I think I did a video on it, that at one point in this province alone, we were under a emergency act. Nobody really realized it, but the government could at any time, you know, commandeered any equipment that it deemed necessary towards the effort. And that was just in that, of course they didn't do this because, you know, they didn't want the pushback, and there would have definitely been pushback. But what I'm saying is that these things can be there without people even really realizing it. So the best thing you can do, the most auspicious thing you can do towards the end of preserving your civil liberties is preparedness, self-reliance. I often hear a lot of pundits trying to galvanize people in a very populist frenzy. To what end, though? To vote for a different executive of the government that really you're not going to see a massive difference in your life? Or should you be focused on what's going on a local level, you know, within your municipality? It's not to say that you completely disregard the federal level, but you focus on what you can do first and foremost, what your family can do, what your network can do, what your community can do, what your municipality, your region, your province, your state, and you work in that direction. And it all starts with you taking care of yourself physically, getting prepared, getting squared away, not relying on government, because the government will do what's best for the government. And the Ukraine government demonstrated that. That was the trial run. Okay, Ukraine is the trial run for the West. For all these people who say Ukraine is the bulwark and bastion of democracy, and it's what is holding back the floodgates of authoritarianism from the East, then if they're saying that, then what's happening in Ukraine is what will happen here. Because if they're the example of what democracy is supposed to be, then what's happening there will happen here. So just get ready for it, because it's going to happen. It's going to come quick. If and when it comes, the more entangled we become in this conflict, and the more the Russians push us towards the Polish border, the greater the likelihood that you are going to start to see people go silent. Okay? And that's an indication to me that things aren't going so well for us. Now, you guys know I like to see both sides of this conflict. I don't always believe the alternative views that are insisting that Ukraine is finished. There's people who've been saying Ukraine is finished for a long time, and of course that just hasn't materialized yet. So, you know, I try to view this objectively, which is why the only way we can really know what's going on, because this war is so nebulous, the fog of war is so thick, the only real way you can know what's going on in the front line is in the signals, the indicators as to what's going on back home. And one of the telltale signs is dissent being stifled? If it is, then you pretty much know that it's not going so well. Now, the good news with respect to that is that maybe the risk of nuclear war is lowered. However, it could go any way at this point, because I do believe also that if we were truly concerned that Ukraine was losing, we would be doing more. We'd be sending more missiles, we'd be sending more tanks. What they're trying to do is a Machiavellian play where they're trying to keep Ukraine at a certain, what do they call it, a rested state of military development, so to speak, so that they can fight off the Russians in an attritional war, but not gain such an upper hand to provoke a nuclear response and not become so powerful that they're actually a threat to the people who are supporting them, which is NATO. Okay? So that's pretty much all I got to say for today. Let me know what your thoughts on this are in the comment section below. I assure you, this is beyond the realm of what is normal when I'm talking about people being silenced, people being deplatformed and demonetized. It's been happening with greater frequency, and it's been happening to a lot of people that I'm familiar with, not people I'm particularly friends with or anything like that, but people I'm familiar with. And it's a sign that something is going on, because it wouldn't just be happening right now of all times for no reason. Now, you could maybe make the argument that it has something to do with the election next year. That is possible, but I don't know. There's two ways this war ends. One, we win. One, we lose. But ultimately, we lose. So the only thing you can do is prepare yourself and your family, guys. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.